Hello and welcome to the show that doesn't have a name yet. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and I also go by my public secret name of David Reynolds, or sometimes even John David Reynolds. And this video is going to be one of a series in which I read interesting, arguably important ancient Buddhist texts and then give a little bit of commentary. And one reason why I'm going to read this one, which is the Lokayatika Sutta, is first of all, I've mentioned it a few times in various contexts recently. And also, it seems like it's a good response to a few people that I've been wrangling with a little bit lately who, although presumably they are Buddhists, I know at least some of them are, they nevertheless insist that the Buddha taught that we have an immortal soul. And really, in the texts, the ancient Pali texts anyway, I have never seen any indication that the Buddha really taught that we have a soul. But um, if somebody can come up with some explanation of a soul that isn't specifically denied in the texts, then even though he never said we do have a soul that is real, um, nevertheless, because he didn't specifically deny their preferred version, then they say, well, there you go. It's in accordance with Buddhism that we have a soul. So this little sutta, the Lokayatika Sutta, in a way, it kind of explains the Buddhist position with regard to the existence of a soul, even though it doesn't actually mention the soul anywhere. And I suppose I should specify this is in the Samyutta Nikaya and in the Nidana Samyutta. So that's the collection of suttas that is specifically referring to dependent co-arising or Paticcasamuppada, the Nidana Samyutta of the Samyutta Nikaya. And this is, so it's Samyutta 1248. So it's the 48th sutta in the 12th collection of the Samyutta Nikaya. And the 12th collection is the one specifically referring to or based on the theme of dependent co-arising. And you're going to find, or else I'm just going to explain to you now, that this sutta is really, it really consists of 4 or 5 distinct blocks that have just been added together, with only the second or third, depending on how we divide it up, being really the important part, and all the rest is just kind of added on. So we'll get into that after I read this. First, I'll just read the entire sutta in its entirety, which took a little work because even if you look in the Pali Tipitaka, the original Pali version of it, it's abbreviated because some of these passages in this sutta are repeated so often that they just put what is called a pala, or it's just like 3 dots or something. They just skip over it because they don't want to keep saying the same thing over and over again because so many suttas say exactly the same words. So I had to look around in different suttas to get all the words because I want to read the entire sutta, and it's not a very long one, so it shouldn't take more than a couple minutes here. So, the Lokayatika Sutta. Thus have I heard, at one time the Blessed One was dwelling at Sawati in Jeta's Grove in Anatta Pandika's park. At that time a Brahmin who was a worldly philosopher, or a Lokayatika, approached the Blessed One and exchanged the customary friendly greetings with him, and sitting to one side, that Brahmin worldly philosopher said this to the Blessed One: "How is it, Sir Gautama? Does everything exist?" And the Buddha says, "Everything exists. Indeed, Brahman, this is the oldest philosophy of the world." Then the Brahmin says, "Well then, how is it, Sir Gautama? Does nothing exist?" And the Buddha says, "Nothing exists. Indeed, Brahman, this is the second philosophy of the world." Then the Brahmin says, Well then, how is it, Sir Gotama? Is everything a unity? The Buddha says, everything is a unity. Indeed, Brahman, this is the third philosophy of the world. Then the Brahmin says, well then, how is it, Sir Gotama? Is everything a multiplicity? The Buddha says, everything is a multiplicity. Indeed, Brahman, this is the fourth philosophy of the world. But not tending to either extreme, Brahman, the Tathagata teaches the way by the middle. Dependent on ignorance, there are karma formations. Dependent on karma formations, consciousness. Dependent on consciousness, name and form. Dependent on name and form, the six senses. Dependent on the six senses, stimulation. Dependent on stimulation, feeling. Dependent on feeling, craving. Dependent on craving, uptake. Dependent on uptake, the force of existence. Dependent on the force of existence, birth. Dependent on birth is aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And thus is the arising of this whole mass of unease. And from the fading away and cessation without remainder of this very ignorance, there is the cessation of karma formations. From the cessation of karma formations, the cessation of consciousness. From the cessation of consciousness, the cessation of name and form. From the cessation of name and form, the cessation of the six senses. From the cessation of the six senses, the cessation of stimulation. From the cessation of stimulation, the cessation of feeling. From the cessation of feeling, the cessation of craving. From the cessation of craving, the cessation of uptake. From the cessation of uptake, the cessation of the force of existence. From the cessation of the force of existence, the cessation of birth. And from the cessation of birth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair also cease. And thus is the cessation of this whole mass of unease. When this had been said, the Brahman worldly philosopher said this, excellent Sir Gotama, excellent Sir Gotama, just as, Sir Gotama, one would set aright what had been tipped over, would reveal what had been covered, would explain the road to one who was lost, or would hold up an oil lamp in the darkness so that those with eyes could see what is visible. Even so, the Dhamma has been showed by Sir Gotama in many ways. I go to Sir Gotama for refuge, and to the Dhamma and to the community of monks. May Sir Gotama consider me to be a lay supporter from this day onward. For the rest of my life, I have taken refuge. And that's the end of the sutta. And I said that this sutta could be divided up into 4 or 5 portions. And I'll go over each portion just to kind of explain what I mean here. The first part is the thus have I heard, at one time the Blessed One was dwelling in Sawati at Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's Park. And hundreds of suttas start with those exact words. Especially I have read in the Samyutta Nikaya, it's the Buddha is staying here more than anywhere else at the beginning of a sutta. If it states where the Buddha delivered a sermon in a Theravada Buddhist text, this is the place that's more often than anywhere else. It's like a, what do you call it? It's not the majority of places, but it's a, I can't remember what it's called, a plurality or something. It's the most common place. And I've also read that that is only in Theravada. So in other schools, the most common place for him to give the exact same sutta is somewhere else. So you have the exact same sutta, but in different schools of Buddhism, they have him saying it in different places, which indicates that at the time, probably Sawati was a stronghold of Theravada, or at least that's what the scholars say. So the next portion is also more or less of a stock block of words, with just the identity of the person talking being different in each different version. And that's at that time a Brahmin who was a worldly philosopher approached the Blessed One and exchanged the customary friendly greetings with him. And sitting to one side, that Brahmin worldly philosopher said this to the Blessed One. So that's also very common at the beginning of a text. It's just the same, exchanging the customary friendly greetings and so forth, with just the identity of the person being different in each case. So then the next part, which is like the second part of B, the way I've got it divided up is the first part was A, and the the part that I just mentioned was the first part of B, and then now we're going into the second part of B, which is like the actual meat, where the worldly philosopher is asking the Buddha the questions, and the Buddha is just saying, this is the first, the second, the third, the fourth philosophy of the world. And then we come to the next section, which I've got as C here on my little translation, and that is the Buddha essentially giving this long formula of dependent co-arising, or Paticcasamuppada, which is in it's 12 links, starting with ignorance and ending with the aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And I suppose I can get back to that a little bit, but first I'm going to go to the last section, and that's where the Brahman is saying, excellent Sir Gautama, just as Sir Gautama, one would set aright what had been tipped over, etc. And that also is just completely stock. Aside from just the identity of the person, that's just like the exact same words that most other people who are converted by a discourse of the Buddha say in the text. And again, different ancient schools of Buddhism had their own formula. So I can get back to that a little later. But with regard to the 12 links of dependent co-arising, which really I do not consider to be original, and I mean, obviously it doesn't really fit here. It's just been plugged in. But most of it is relatively, I mean, any of you who are familiar with the concept of dependent co-arising are probably familiar with most of the words. You start with ignorance, or avidya, and then you've got karma formations, which is sankhara, and then dependent on karma formations is consciousness, or vijnana. Dependent on consciousness is name and form, namarupa. Dependent on name and form are the six senses, the salayatana. Dependent on the six senses, I have stimulation. Usually it's translated as contact, which is phassa. And then dependent on stimulation is feeling, or vedana. Dependent on feeling is craving, or tanha. Dependent on craving is, I call it uptake, which is the literal translation of upadana, although usually it's translated as clinging, sometimes as attachment. And then dependent on uptake is the force of existence, which is bhava. And I'm not even exactly sure what the usual translation of bhava is. Usually it means something like becoming. That would be like the literal translation would be like becoming, or just existence. And then depending on the force of existence is the long list of the, it comes birth, or jati, and then after birth is the long list of aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And then you've got like the reverse, the cessation, the reverse order, or the like, saying from this arising, that arises, and then the second part is this ceasing, that ceases. And I've written about this elsewhere, so I've got this little text here of that followed this translation in the original place where I wrote this. So I'll just read this, and then we can get into a little more. And that is as follows. If one considers this discourse, one may see that the theory of the 12 links is somewhat anomalous. First, the Buddha dismisses multiplicity as an extreme, and then rattles off a stock list of terms which clearly implies multiplicity. If the 12 Nidana theory is true, then it would seem that multiplicity is also true. In fact, Orthodox Theravada clearly asserts multiplicity with, for example, the 82 ultimate realities of the Abhidhamma philosophy. On the other hand, Orthodox tradition has nothing resembling the unity extreme, which could balance out this apparent multiplicity of the system. A plausible explanation of this sutta is that the dialogue of section B, which is the important part, existed more or less as it exists now before the stock formula of section C was added. The very unusualness of the dialogue is one bit of evidence that it is very old, and it would hardly be added after the patently pluralistic teachings of later Theravada had become standard. The stock formula could easily have been plugged in to replace some other explanation after it had come into vogue. Section C above is exactly the same in many suttas, hundreds of suttas in fact, as are sections A and D, with the sole exception of the name of the person who is converted. Section D is especially noteworthy in this regard, and I fully expanded it from the abbreviated form in which it was found in the sutta. Obviously, it is a stock formula artificially plugged into the discourse, as it is hardly likely that almost any non-Buddhist Buddha converted was likely to respond in exactly these same words. It seems even less likely that so many people would utter this exact same speech when one considers that other schools of ancient Indian Buddhism had their own stock conversion speech for lay people and non-Buddhist philosophers. Considering this, the idea that section C also was artificially plugged into the sutta, with section C being the 12 links of dependent co-arising in the standard formula, after the 12-link theory became official dogma appears very possible, if not downright likely. This method of inserting blocks of standardized text, or even of cobbling together whole suttas from such building blocks, apparently ran rampant during the formulation of the early Buddhist canon. And I'm not going to try to explain the evolution of the 12 Nidana theory. If you're really interested in that, you can find my arguments in an article that I wrote called "What Did the Buddha Really Teach," which is available on the nippapancha.org website, nippapanca.org. And that was I was trying to describe the evolution of this 12 Nidana theory, because I really do not think it was original. There is an older version, presumably an older version of dependent co-arising, which is also found in a number of places in the suttas, which is very simple. And it just goes, this being, that is, from the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that is not. From the ceasing of that, that ceases. Which is probably comes much closer to the original meaning of this elaborate 12 links. And even the 12 links, it's controversial exactly what it means. If you go with the commentarial interpretation, then some of the links apply to a person's previous life, which is the first two. Let's see here. That would be ignorance and karma formations. Then the karma formations in your last life result in consciousness, which is interpreted in the commentarial tradition as rebirth linking consciousness, which is your first conscious moment in your next life as an embryo. And then it goes through this life until you get to, let's see, bhava. And bhava, according to the commentaries, is just, it's a synonym for sankhara. So you've got like a short circuit in this 12 Nidana theory, where two of the terms have exactly the same meaning. Sankhara towards the beginning and bhava closer towards the end, both just mean karma. Although the first one, sankhara, is your karma in your previous life, and then the bhava later on in the list is your karma in this life, which then leads to birth of your next life. So the orthodox interpretation of this 12 Nidana theory, which again I think really is an artifact, I don't think it originated all the way back to the Buddha. It extends over 3 lives: your past life, this life, and your future life. And also, in addition to that, it does seem that it leaves out an important link. It goes straight from feeling to craving, and it seems like you could have at least 1 or 2 extra links added in between feeling and craving, something like perception, for example. But they left that out. And I do try to give like examples of the past evolution. There are numerous versions of dependent co-arising that you can find in the text. In fact, the Nidana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, which is the largest exposition on dependent co-arising, doesn't have the same 12 Nidanas. And some versions start with perception or with papancha sankha, which is essentially the same as perception. It's like differentiating designation. So mainly the reason why I'm bringing this up, again, is to deal with the idea of whether we have a soul or not. And I mean, that could be one of the questions here. I mean, it's like the worldly philosopher here, the Lokayatika, I mean, he might as well be asking, how is it, Sir Gautama? Do we have a soul? And then the Buddha could say, well, that's the fifth oldest philosophy of the world. And then he would say, well, do we not have a soul? And then the Buddha would say, well, that's the sixth philosophy of the world. It's like, does everything exist is an extreme. Does everything not exist is an extreme. Does the soul exist is an extreme. Does the soul not exist is an extreme. And it's really mind-boggling. I mean, you can't really figure it out logically or rationally. You can't figure it out intellectually, really, because the whole purpose of this middle way is is just cutting through all of this. It's cutting through um, just distinctions in a way. It's um, I've said before that if you really want to understand dependent co-arising, um, you should read Nagarjuna, especially his Mula Majjhimaka Karika. And the whole point of that is that really nothing has any intrinsic self-existence. Nothing exists on its own. It only exists conditionally or provisionally or virtually. And that applies to non-existence too. So you can't say that anything really ultimately exists as an individual, but you also can't say that nothing really doesn't exist. So it just cuts through that because its duality, is and isn't, are just an artificial construction of the mind. And even though we're just completely stuck in that, we really cannot fathom anything that neither exists nor doesn't exist. And then going with Buddhist logic, I mean, you have to rule out, I mean, they rule out exists as invalid. They rule out doesn't exist as invalid. They rule out does and doesn't exist as invalid. And they rule out neither does nor doesn't exist as invalid. You cannot say anything about its existence or non-existence that is fully valid. The whole thing is invalid because it's just a mental construct, and it really does not apply to ultimate reality. So there are some people that say, well, because of that, or whatever. I mean, the Buddha denied all possibilities, therefore somehow we have a soul anyway. But yeah, it doesn't. There, I mean, there are some people that want to say, well, obviously an illusion has to be based on some reality, and I would have to go along with that. But the reality is neither is nor isn't. And so the middle path, the middle way, it wasn't trying to explain within a samsaric context how we keep being reborn, which is the way the commentarial tradition has interpreted it. It's more just, how does anything seem to exist at all, or even how does anything seem not to exist? And according to the legend, the Buddha almost just didn't teach Buddhism at all. He was just going to be a silent hermit Buddha, a Pacceka Buddha. And because he just figured nobody would understand this, nobody would understand dependent co-arising, nobody would understand Paticcasamuppada. And somehow, amazingly, this Lokayatika, he was like a cosmologist. In Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, he calls him a cosmologist, or it was a sort of kind of a materialist philosopher. I think in ancient India they were called Charvakas. Somehow this cosmologist understood all that, and it made perfect sense to him. And he's just raving towards the end about how wonderful it is. But obviously, we could listen to this, and it wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense to us because we don't even have the commentarial tradition, handy when we're hearing this to explain to us what the Buddha meant. So, yeah, it's just a mind blower, and people keep asking me to explain dependent co-arising, and when the Buddha himself couldn't explain it, or at least thought that nobody would understand it, and to this day, most people really don't. Like Burmese monks, they'll just memorize the 12 list, the 12 links in the list, and think that they understand it when all they've really done is understood the 12 links, what the words mean according to the commentaries. So yeah, I mean, it's a mind blower, and the answer really, I mean, there is no answer. It's like a Zen koan. So do we have a soul? You can, I mean, yes is invalid and no is invalid, and both is invalid and neither is invalid. So when Buddhism started emphasizing no self, it was really just taking a convenient choice because you really have to choose one or the other if you're dealing with words. Because obviously, dependent co-arising is just this void. It's like having the rug pulled out from under you and you're just tumbling, just over and over. You got nothing, I mean, there's nothing to cling to at all. And people just can't stand that. So you have to choose one or the other. And most religious systems choose that there is a God, there is a soul, there is an absolute. But Buddhism has chosen to just go with the other extreme, which is isn't. Although in the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, which is, in my opinion, the oldest the oldest large block of really archaic pre-Theravadan Buddhism, um, there are statements in there to the effect that a monk should neither believe in self nor not self, which would be more in accordance with this middle way taught by the Tathagata before the 12 link stock system got added as a block onto this sutta, which thereby kind of makes it almost meaningless. Because, as I say, the Buddha ruled out unity and multiplicity. He ruled out one and more than one. And then you got his explanation of that is this list of obviously more than one things that would thereby seem to endorse multiplicity. So, I mean, his answer doesn't really fit the uh, the presumably much older dialogue that comes before it. And so, yeah, I guess that's good enough. I hope I've confused you all thoroughly, because if you think you understand it intellectually, at least, you really don't, because reality cannot be understood intellectually. Sorry to say it, and that's just the way it is. So be happy, just be in the present moment, and yeah, don't try to figure out ultimate reality. You may have to figure out how to operate the new remote control or the phone or whatever, but trying to understand what is ultimate truth, um, you just can't. You just have to experience it directly and non-symbolically without using thoughts. You can still have thoughts. You just don't take them too seriously, and be happy.